Tonight on Nightline, landmark, a historic ruling, a pivotal change. Is the Supreme Court turning back the clock on race? Anatomy of a Twinkie. Just a simple bit of cake, not so fast. Why you'll never think of the classic snack the same way again. And Eagle Overrun has a symbol of national pride gone from endangered to being a nuisance. Is there such a thing as too many bald eagles?
From the global resources of ABC News, with Terry Moran in Washington, Martin Bashir and Cynthia McFadden in New York City, this is Nightline, June 28, 2007.
Good evening, I'm Terry Moran. Question, do black children and white children have to share the same schools for there to be equality in education? Or think of this one. Should America tolerate what some call the resegregation of our public schools because so few white families and black families live in the same neighborhoods? Well, today, by a slim majority in a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court said schools cannot explicitly take a child's race into account in an effort to achieve integration. And thus they reignited the old, passionate debate. Critics say the court took a big step backwards, but the controversial ruling has some unlikely supporters. ABC's legal correspondent Jan Crawford Greenberg reports.
It was 1975 when Louisville, Kentucky was rocked by a federal court order to integrate its schools.
They are taking our equal rights away from us.
Anti-busing demonstrators took to the streets, rioting, setting fires, attacking the buses taking black children to school.
When the bus pulled up, we pulled up to sticks, clubs, bricks, bottles, mobs of angry parents, shouting things at us, obscenities, the N-word, go back to Africa.
And how old were you then?
I guess I had to be maybe 14, 15.
Taffy Jones and her sister Grace Bell were among the first to ride those buses.
It was an awful experience, an awful, awful experience that I'll never forget.
They're the daughters of Maddie Jones, a veteran civil rights activist, arrested 28 times at marches, protests, and sit-ins.
I grew up in a segregated society, and I did not want my children to suffer like I had suffered. We did tacos tonight.
Maddie Jones' 9 children are grown now, and she's grandma to 31. Crystal Meredith lives on the other side of Louisville from Maddie Jones.
So the school is really a part of this neighborhood.
It really is.
Meredith was just a toddler during those turbulent times. Today, she's a 34-year-old single mom whose life, almost by accident, intersects with Maddie Jones in one of the most significant cases on race and segregation in half a century. Civil rights leaders say her victory today in the Supreme Court will undo all their efforts to integrate schools. So you might be surprised by how Maddie Jones feels about the triumph of Crystal Meredith.
Thank you.
Why? Because these two women, each from a very different part of Louisville, Kentucky, both want the same thing, a good education for their children at schools in their own neighborhoods.
This never had anything to do with race. It was just wanting what was best for my child.
We don't have to sit next to a white person, a white child, our kids don't, to be educated.
He was friends with quite a few of the blacks. And
Maddie Jones, her son Michael, her daughters Taffy and Grace and Merlin, and their children, they lived through Louisville's struggle to integrate.
Believe it or not, there are some children that had never seen a black child.
And after all the conflict and sacrifice, after Jones's children were bused from inferior schools in their own neighborhoods to white schools across town, after all that,
we're in worse shape now than we were 20 years ago.
The Joneses say it wasn't worth it.
It was something that was doomed to fail, and it did, miserably. It failed, but I think it primarily failed African American and poor kids.
For 2 generations of children in Louisville, the solution to racial segregation has been to climb aboard a school bus.
It all started more than 30 years ago.
1975, that was the year of busing.
Whites were already fleeing the city for the suburbs. On Louisville's Black West Side, schools were understaffed and under-resourced, with tattered books and next to no supplies. So a federal judge ordered busing to integrate Louisville's schools. The Joneses' children rode into a firestorm.
They could not understand why they were called the N-word, and they never heard it in their neighborhood schools. I found myself part-time working because I was on the bus stop with Grace and Taffy.
Why?
Because some mornings were dark, so I would have to get out there on that bus stop to make sure my children were safe.
Soldiers and police also rode the buses to protect the children from angry parents.
And how many people would be out there?
Parking lot full of people. I mean, as a little girl back then, it seemed like thousands of people to me, and I'm so far away from home, and it was the feeling of all of them are trying to get to me.
But all 9 of Maddie Jones's children stayed in school. They graduated and sent their own children to schools across town by bus. 7 years ago, Louisville adopted a plan that lets parents have more of a say in where their children go to school. But skin color still counts. Under the new plan, schools have to meet certain racial guidelines. They can't be too white or too black.
Here in Louisville, more than 60,000 children ride a bus to school every day, many of them leaving their own neighborhoods to go across town, just so the schools will be racially balanced.
And that brings us back to Crystal Meredith and where her life intersects with Maddie Jones.
There was a school right around the corner that I had tried to get him into.
Her son Josh is now 10, and she fiercely protects his privacy. So fiercely, she would only let us use this one photo of him taken from behind. When Josh was in kindergarten, Meredith wanted to send him to a school in the neighborhood, Bloom Elementary. But the Jefferson County school system assigned him to Whitney Young in Maddie Jones' neighborhood on Louisville's mostly black west side. When Meredith applied for a transfer,
They sent me a letter.
And what did it say?
It said that your transfer has been denied because of his race. And then it stated the quota that they must have at that school.
she didn't want her 5-year-old riding the school bus alone. So every day, Meredith drove right by Bloom Elementary when she took Josh back and forth to school across town.
It was stressful on the visitation schedule because it took a good deal of time to drive and pick him up.
Meredith was seeing her lawyer to work out the schedule. She mentioned how hard it was commuting to and from Josh's school.
He said he could take care of the problem, and I assumed he'd make a phone call and work it out. Then the next thing I know, we are going to federal court. So that was a surprise to me. But he said that it was a discrimination of Josh's rights, and that we were going to fight for that.
The issue, whether schools could consider race in assigning students, became a federal case with her name on it and landed in the Supreme Court last December. In the meantime, Josh finally got a transfer to Bloom.
And this was a school that you would have to drive by to get to the school they sent Josh to.
Right, and we could have walked here, but instead we had to drive past it every day on our 45-minute trip to the other school.
There are cases that define such important legal principles that most Americans know them by a single name. Cases where a name becomes iconic in history.
Save Roe.
In abortion, it's Roe. In criminal rights, it's Miranda. In school desegregation, it's Brown, as in Brown versus Board of Education. So now, in a twist of fate, add to that roll call the name Meredith, an accidental agitator who just wanted to send her son to a neighborhood school.
I did this for what's best for my son, and I can't imagine that any other parent would do anything any differently.
Neither can Maddie Jones, who wants her grandchildren to come back to her neighborhood.
I just hate the fact that they have destroyed neighborhood schools in the western part of Louisville. I used to sit on my porch to hear the laughter and the chatter. That's gone from our neighborhoods. All we hear now is the noise of the buses.
She wants Louisville to make the neighborhood schools better.
It's time we demand, not ask, for the Board of Education to do the right thing, to rebuild our schools. We're demanding this.
Today's landmark decision won't stop the school buses crisscrossing Louisville, but it will stop the school system from putting children on those school buses just because of the color of their skin. I'm Jan Crawford Greenberg for Nightline in Louisville, Kentucky.